Welcome guys. I just want to show you how you can set record types for your pre-existing records before the creation of record types. Now say you have a request from your client to retroactively assign record types to millions of records. You can apply record type ID manually and import using the data loader, but this is going to be very strenuous. However, a batch Apex can do this asynchronously. So how do you implement the batch Apex? The first step is to create a class to implement the database.batchable interface. The next step is to execute the batch. You can actually do this through the user interface, but I'm going to be executing the code from the execute anonymous. Finally, you monitor your batch jobs. The async Apex job class will do this for us. This is the database.batchable interface. It is a standard Salesforce interface. It has three methods. This is the start method. It is meant for gathering record for processing. It is followed by the execute method. It defines and perform modifications to records. It does this in chunks of 200 records. However, you can go beyond this default value per transaction. And the last is the finish method. It is executed at the end. So this is the interface framework. As you can see, the method signatures are there, but the body of each method is empty. To use this interface, another class must implement it by providing a body for all the methods contained in this interface. This will do in the developer console. I'm logged into my org right now as I navigate to the case records. You find out that there are two record types, the internal and external. For the internal, the type field pick list values are this, order, payroll, and HR. And for the external, these are the pick list values for the type field. Another way to get information around record type for the case record is to use the record type info class. However, I prefer to use the query editor. To the query editor, so let's select ID, name from record type, where a subject is equal to case. You can see that we have two record types, the internal, the external, and this ID for the two record types. To get a clearer picture, let's move on to the workbench. So I would like to query the following fields for the case object: the ID, the case number, the record type ID, the status field, and the type field. You can see that we have 33 records, case records, and only 2 has record type ID assigned. This HR is for the internal, while this record type ID is for the external. So what we're going to be doing is to set the record type ID for the remaining 31 records. Now imagine that you've got 50 million records in your org and you wish to set the record type for all these records. doing it manually, it's not visible. That's why we need to use the batch apex to set this record type. So the very first step is to create an apex class. So I'm going to name my apex class my batch class. Next, you copy the snipers, the framework that I showed you earlier, and I'm going to paste it here. So this is the start method for the database.batchable interface framework. This is the execute method, and this is the finish method. Now, one thing you need to know is that by default, batch apex is stateless. Now, to preserve state, a stateful interface called database.stateful is specified in the class definition. I want to initialize an instance member variable. Note that this variable will be kept around for each transaction and are useful to retain state across all executions when using the database.stateful interface. It's an integer and the name is record processed. Now over to the start method to collect the records to be passed for processing. The records are passed to the database.query locator and not to the iterable scope. The reason for this is that the query locator with simple SOQL query can generate the scope of the case object that we require for this batch job. This iterable scope is used for complex Apex code, so we'll do away with it. This method is called once at the beginning of the batch Apex job, and it returns a list of case records to be processed by calling the database dot get query locator with a simple SOQL query. The case record fields that I'm going to be gathering for processing include the ID field, the status field, the type field, and the record type ID field from case objects. To the execute method, this method takes reference to the database.batchable context objects and also to the list of records. But since we are working on case records, so this should be case. Like I stated earlier, the execute method processes records in batches where one batch represents 200 records. That is by default. But however, you can go above this number. Next, I want to assign string variables to the record type IDs. So this is for the internal and also for the external. Next, I would like to create a list of case records to contain all the case records upon completion of the logic. Next, I like to iterate over all the case records in my org using the for each loop. Now for records with no record type ID assigned, as the record type ID is null, and the case type, the type field, is equal to electrical. What I want is that I want the case record type ID assigned external. As if there are records, case records with no record type assigned, and the case type is mechanical. I also want the record type ID assigned external. Now, since there are 4 pick list values for the case type field, whenever the record type is external, I'm going to repeat the else if statement for electronic and for structural pick list values. So this will go for electronic, and this is for structural. Otherwise, for all the other records, if the case type field pick list value is not one of the above, I want the record type assigned internal. Next, I would like to add the updated case S object to the list I created earlier. Now, before I update the case records, I would like to increment the instance member counter. That's the record process integer I created earlier. Finally, on the execute method, I want to update my case record. To the finalization logic, in the final method, I want to monitor my job and send a notification email to myself to indicate successful completion of the batch job. Now, each batch Apex invocation creates an async Apex job record. So you can track the progress of your job. You use the ID of the record to construct a SQL query to retrieve information like the job status, number of errors, total number of items, and others. So information about the batch job that I would like to view include the ID, the status, the total number of job item, the number of errors, where the ID is the ID of the batch job. Before I invoke the batch class, I would like to send a mail to myself to view information about the job as I stated earlier. The first thing to do is to declare the message. Next, I like to set the subject of my mail. This is followed by the body of my mail. It's a plain text body. And this will include the total job item, and also the instant member variable, which we named record processed. And also the number of errors. So I'm going to be specifying the recipient of my mail. I'm actually sending the mail to two email addresses. The first is to, and then I want to set the email addresses. Now, before I invoke the batch class, I like to send the mail. Now, I love to execute this code, but before I do that, I like to state that the test for this code I'm gonna execute in the next video, and also the variables representing the record type ID, they are strings already. So it is wrong for me to put them in quotes again like I did here. So taking away the quotes. Now to execute the code, I navigate to the execute anonymous window. As you can see, this first line instantiates the class, my batch class, while the second one calls the database.executeBatch method. Now we can execute the code. No exception was thrown. Now the first place I want us to visit is the one of the mail addresses I stated earlier. As you can see, the batch job was processed. One batch was processed. 33 records were actually processed, and no errors. So finally, to the workbench, I want to refresh the query results. As you can see, all the 31 remaining records have been assigned record types. Thank you for watching this video, and if you like it, kindly like this video. Thank you very much.